Good afternoon and welcome back to the AZAPO online political education series. Today I am hosting Ebrahim Fakir, and he is going to be discussing with us the aspects of poverty and inequality and critiquing South Africa's development model, looking around those concepts. Ebrahim Fakir is a director of programs at ASRI, the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, and previously he was the head of political parties and parliamentary program at EISA, and he also was formerly a senior researcher and analyst at the Center for Policy Studies in Johannesburg, and he has worked with IDASA at both the Pretoria and Cape Town offices. And as some of you would know, Ebrahim has done a lot of work around the elections programs of our country, and has done a lot of analysis and has helped a lot of political parties with analysis around elections. He was awarded the Ruth First Fellowship for 2014 at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and also played a role there as a part-time lecturer at the School of Governance. That was in 2018. Welcome, Ebrahim, to the AZAPO online political education program. I'm glad to be playing host to you this afternoon. As you know, models, general economic models, set out key relationships between economic variables, and more so if you look at macroeconomic models, where basically everything relates to everything, and as some kind of a necessity for setting out some kind of a development model, and these macroeconomic models, they help to capture, excuse me, important effects and linkages in the economy, and these linkages are used, to develop some kind of policies whose implications are factored into the growth of a country. And these variables look at growth, and they look at poverty, they look at employment and issues like inflation and inequality. So it would be great to hear from you as to what your thoughts are around aspects of poverty and inequality as you critique South Africa's development model. Our government uses a set of policy tools such as taxation, public expenditure, credit access, and interest rate changes, in pursuit of its own developmental agenda. So it's going to be interesting to hear what you think around this subject as a person who has been very closely following the developments of our development trajectory, if any, since the beginning of time. Welcome again to our program. So I want to give this opportunity to you to speak to our audience.
Comrade Simpiwe, thank you very much, and welcome to all of the comrades, and I owe you all a huge thanks for inviting me to speak to all of you. I always look forward to speaking to comrades from AZAPO because they're probably the most intellectual of the
Thank you.
So the moniker of the 1980s of Amazimzim, it was not entirely misplaced. But I'm not going to talk as I did previously to comrades about Hegel and Marx. I'm going to now try and talk, as you've requested, about the development trajectory. And thanks, Simpiwe, for a very kind introduction. it's kind, and it kind of assumes that I know more than I actually do, firstly. But also, secondly, the topic assumes that I've done a heck of a lot of work, and I've done some work on the question of our development trajectory. And so, to begin, I would have to ask the question, if we say, can we critique South Africa's development trajectory? Critiquing something would mean that that something actually exists in the first place. And I'm not entirely certain that we can say that South Africa has had a development trajectory. And to the extent that we have had one, I'm going to try and trace what their lineage and what its lineage has been and what its impact and consequences have been. Now, I also don't want to be overly formal in how I go about this. So if there's any interventions or anything from your side, Simpiwe, or if one of the participants would like to do so, I'm more than happy to entertain that. But the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to kind of sketch first a periodization. So I'm first going to talk about specific periods of our post-apartheid trajectory. But inevitably, as we go, I'll have to trace the roots or the thinking of this pre-apartheid. Now, be that as it may, let me kick off by saying that in the periodization that I take, and I will outline certain features of these specific periods, I want to start with the period 1990 to 1994. And in a somewhat curious turn, I will return to a period before 1990 a little bit later on. But for now, let's just take 1990 to 1993 or 1994. And we can characterize that as the period of transition. And in that period of transition, obviously, we know lots of discussion about what form and character the negotiations should take, who would be represented in those negotiations, on what basis, and what would be the key issues that would be determined. So the things that were determined were the nature of the state, the form of the state, the fact that it would be a constitutional state or a constitutional democracy. In terms of the economy, economic policy remained largely intact as the main negotiating parties, and I'm going to talk here about the liberation movement, the ANC, one of them, because we know AZAPO was not yet fully sure about where AZAPO stood with regard to the negotiations. But in any event, the ANC was busy preparing this document called Ready to Govern in that period and what the outline of that Ready to Govern would mean. But insofar as there was extensive discussion about what ought to be discussed in the negotiation, one of the key features was about the nature, character, and form of the state. But not that much, by the way, on the question of economic policy. Simultaneously, at that time, there was a guy called Vela Pillay, who was a member of the Communist Party, but was sort of kicked out before that, who was simultaneously running something called the Macroeconomic Research Group, which had a group of economists who was working with him on developing a framework of what a post-apartheid economy would look like. And much of that, unfortunately, may have informed a little bit about the Reconstruction and Development Program post-94, but a lot of that was in fact ignored. And so the first thing, one of the things we need to do is to go back to that macroeconomic research group and look at what it said. So the point I'm making is in that period, there wasn't much being discussed about the economy. There were inklings that we would be looking at a welfare state. How that came to pass, we'll come on to just now in a moment. But for now, what we can say is that period 1990 to 94 was characterized by this period of negotiations. Come 1994, it's the first democratic elections. Logistically, it was well managed. Some people say, well, the result was actually a compromise because certain people had to be accommodated in some ways. But largely, the nature and the form of the state then took root. And we can then describe that period, 1994 to 1998 or 1999, if you want to be absolutely precise, but I like to think of it as 1994 to 1998. What happened was that it was the amalgamation of the old Bantustans into South Africa proper. And so many of those inherited public servants, the systems by which they worked, the institutions, the offices, and in some cases, to the extent that there were any resources, the resources were all now incorporated into South Africa. Not that the resources were generated on their own, largely much of it was subsidized by apartheid South Africa, right? If you remember, as part of their separate development policy. So in any event, all of that is incorporated into South Africa proper. It inherits whatever existed there to court, including the communities and society such as it existed. And we know that the infrastructure was, in fact, extremely poor. The nature of the economy in those areas was extremely poor, particularly when it came to things like the productive economy and so on. Although what you did have was you had apartheid-era businesses, which sometimes ran factories and so on in those areas because they didn't have to deal with unions, for one. For two, they were given tax concessions and tax breaks. For three, they thought it's a slightly freer environment. They didn't have the extent of duties and so on that they could pay. And suddenly they double dipped because they were getting a subsidy both from the apartheid state, but also from that Bantustan administration. So to the extent that anything existed, it was manufacturing, very light industry, but the large cohort of that economy was in fact composed of the public service. And so in that period, 1994 to 1998, that was in the main the type of characterization of societies. We're working through the reconciliation process. It incepted a reconstruction and development program, sure, but that was soon ditched. Come 1998, that had completely almost gone. And so to the extent the reconstruction and development program had some kind of impact on the economy and the development trajectory, it was not as profound as it was hoped to be, partly because establishing the offices, getting the processes and procedures going really took a long time. But you already got the inklings of what was called a developmental state, but certainly the largest social welfare state in sub-Saharan Africa. And so all of the plans were being mooted at that time for the rollout of basic public services, the extension of primary healthcare and primary education, things like housing, and the RDP housing process was incepted during that period. So was ideas around cross-subsidization of municipal entities, and this cross-subsidization took two forms. A is that because we know the apartheid balkanization of urban areas, of urban South Africa at least, but it applied to peri-urban or semi-urban and even rural areas, were balkanized and spatially defined in ways in which blacks, as we know, were in dormant townships and so on. So the first type of cross-subsidization that was mooted was that the historically privileged, and they were largely white areas, in spite of the gray areas emerging in the late 80s, by and large, these areas were white. And so when people spoke in class terms about slightly better off people, that they would pay slightly higher rates for services, they would pay slightly higher taxes, local taxes that is, so that they could cross-subsidize those poorer areas. The second area of cross-subsidization was that utilities such as museums, parks, recreation facilities, community halls, and so on, things that cannot generate their own revenue, those things would be cross-subsidized, or they would be subsidized from the pool of resources that the municipalities or the local state, so to speak, would be collecting from others. And so that was one for. So you can see the elements of welfareism kicking in, right? A massive rollout of public education, public health, RDP, social housing, and coming up with models, even though they weren't incepted yet. But the models are, well, we can have RDP housing for those who are completely poor, but it wasn't terribly well located. They weren't built to great quality, whatever the case might be. There was then a second issue around those who have moderate means and moderate income, who would be in social housing where they could rent to own, or they could live in areas or in places where they would be paying minimal rental, but they would have to be paying something because they at least have some means. How is economic expansion then thought about? Well, this is where the germination of things like BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, affirmative action, affirmative procurement, and this is an important one, the question of procurement, starts to take shape and is incepted, or the thinking happens in this period, but is really put into the effect in the next period, which is the period I want to talk about now, which is 1998 to around 2006. And so during 1998, I would consider this the period. And so the first period, if we can just quickly call it that, 1990 to 1994 was the period of transition and stabilization. The second was the period of stabilization and reconstruction, because we kind of reconciliation and reconstruction in the sense that the society is being reconstructed, its institutions are being repurposed, they are being more inclusive, and all of those things. But we know that in terms of economic policy, there isn't terribly much that happens in that period, right? Then, and we can characterize that first period also as being part of democratization and state building. Come to the period 1998, which is where I'm going to focus on now, we can talk about some degree of consolidation of the gains which were achieved in 1994, and we can characterize it as the era of development and delivery, because that's what Mr. Mbeki was largely viewed as Mr. Delivery, not the people who deliver food, but his presidency was about delivery. And remember the discussions about the developmental state and what the developmental state would look like. And so all of the things that were thought about in that first period of reconstruction and development and stabilization are now actually starting to take root in terms of policy. There's a much more managerial approach to the state, even though that might have come at some of the democratic indicators of inclusion, of solidarity, and so on, even though many of the policies were based on solidarity. But it's only really here that the beginnings of what one would call the neoliberal state starts to take effect. And suddenly all the things that you were speaking about or were being spoken about in the previous period, things like cross-subsidization of municipalities, ideas around the deracialization of spatial and living spaces, some of those didn't come to pass. But worse still, things like basic services, especially in municipalities, were now being animated by the ideas that were current in the neoliberal globalization model, which is the state which subcontracts, the state which outsources, the state which to some extent casualizes, and so you have the rise of labor brokers and so on, and the state which starts to work from an arm's length from some of the core things that it's supposed to do. And so it's packaged in a way in which it says, well, the national state and the state will be determining norms and standards and so on, because that's the role of the global policy player, of the big state, of the person at the preeminent level of decision making, and it will be implemented at lower levels in the provinces and municipalities and so on. And so subcontracting, outsourcing, casualization, those things start to take root, and the casualization doesn't just exist in the private sector. Even the state starts to do so, because the people it is using are in the private sector, many of them white, some of them black, who became labor brokers, by the way. And so some of the things I'm going to say today are going to also not sit very comfortably with all of us, but anyway. And with it comes the policy of BEE, and carry over and intensify affirmative action, affirmative procurement, and Black economic empowerment. And so while in spirit, this sounds like a great package to create partly what was considered to be a patriotic bourgeoisie. A bunch of people who will be patriotic, they will be participating in the economy, they may get some of these shares and other options in big corporates, and they would be captains of industry, but they would be creating work for their people, and people would have greater access to funds and resources, and they would stimulate demand in the economy, and people would be buying, and there would be a multiplier effect. But didn't think sufficiently about the supply side of the economy, firstly. Secondly, it didn't think about the nature of the moral hazards inherent in some of these policies. And here's one of the examples, if I can just elaborate on this for a moment before returning to the grand themes. So some of the issues around affirmative procurement and Black economic empowerment were configured as such that if you have, say, for example, a local clinic or a hospital, its procurement of local goods and services should preferentially happen through a Black supplier. Because of the nature of our history, the Black supplier is a person who only has 5 or 6 trucks, can only buy in bulk at a certain price, and can only deliver things at a slightly longer period of time because of the nature of the facilities and the business that it has, because it's relatively new. It doesn't have a long history. On the other hand, there are other companies who have a much larger network of things like, trucks, logistics, warehousing, managing of the logistics and the supply chains, and could get things out to these clinics and so on much quicker. And so the contradiction is that while you're achieving one kind of policy goal, you are undermining development goals in the sense that there's a lag time at which equipment, medicines, and so on are delivered to hospitals and primary clinics, and so on. And could there be a balance struck between the two? Well, you could strike a balance between the two, and you could, in fact, do this very well, provided the underlying ethics are in place and there is a respect for the regulatory framework, both of which start to break down because of the nature of the incentives built into this for super profiteering, price fixing, for all of those things. And, rightly or wrongly, there is both a non-racial or multiracial and a Black element to this. Because if we're going to be honest, and as I know AZAPO has been, we've got to ask, because our interest is what happens amongst our communities, what happens amongst people who we think are in our constituency. Not that other South Africans are not. But the reality is that the erosion of ethics through the abuse of some of these policies has kind of led to a public ethics which appears to be completely compromised. And we can't put the blame on the foot of everyone else when we are complicit in this. So in part, we got to talk about that ensemble of problems. The second ensemble of problems which emerge at this time is that we talk about, it's the big debates about the nature and character of the developmental state. And so the developmental state has to have certain key features. And some of those key features are a major drive for not just capacity, but skill in the public service. Now, we make much about capacity. And I think a lot of that capacity debate in the Mbeki years was fundamentally misplaced, because it's not as if we lack capacity. It's not as if we lack the skill. It's not as if we lack the resources. In part, there are some of those things, yes, we lack, but they could have been got somehow, or they could have been imported, or they could have been developed over time. And so there was no dedicated development of that, firstly. Secondly, we can't run away from the fact, and it again attaches to some of the question of ethics. We can't run away from the fact that even at that time, we've got far too much slothful, lazy, and bad attitudes in the public service. And so in the dispensing of duties, you've got people who are simply not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that's just calling a spade a spade. People who are supposed to do certain things in the state, but don't do it. The third problem, compounding all of this, is the beginnings of the breakdown of the regulatory state. And this breakdown happens because the compact is that no one respects the rules that are established, whether it's for procurement, whether it's for public spending, whether it's for decision making, which is why you could have municipalities delaying even making decisions around budgets and so on. People would think that's just a feature of the post-coalition era, post-2016. The bad news is that this was happening way before. The fourth, which compounds all of this, is that in line with the neoliberalizing of the state in that period, you also have the drive towards austerity and the idea that we must drive towards a budget surplus, not a modest deficit. And many of us in the development sphere were arguing that actually in that period, remember, growth was an average 4.5%. We could have been running a slightly more modest deficit. And we could have done so because it would have allowed us to expand and extend the basic services, which would have led to greater construction, but it could also have allowed for serious regulatory intervention in the state and in the private sector through things like prescriptive policy and so on. Some of us were arguing for that you need more prescriptive policy. The state needs to take, and a black state for that matter, needs to take a greater amount of responsibility for directing surpluses in the economy, particularly towards production, reducing consumption, not playing around with the value of the rand because we weren't producing enough to justify taking down the value of the rand because we were exporting enough. We weren't. And we were earning their revenue because of a commodities boom, because of tourism, because of those kinds of things. But nevertheless, that drive towards austerity meant that a greater number of services being rolled out were being curtailed, number one. Simultaneous to that, I've already spoken about the fact that things are being outsourced. Those guys to who it's being outsourced and subcontracted are creaming off the top of state contracts because there are incentives built into this, justified some of it on the basis of race, saying that we are now doing this to deracialize the economy, but the developmental outcomes are incredibly poor. And now you compound over all of that the question of austerity. And what does austerity do? It's not only the rollback of some of the services or the lack of investment in expanding the public service. And I was one of the people who was arguing at the time that the public service ought to have been expanded, increased actually, provided we could have greater amount of productivity emerging out of it. That wasn't the case. Nevertheless, not only did we now curtail on investing in broadening access, we also curtailed on the size of the state, and more importantly, directives were being issued by Treasury and the Presidency for that matter, that cost savings ought to have happened. And cost savings were starting to happen in every area other than the real areas where they should be happening. So superfluous expenditure on junkets, expenditure on the good things in government were not being curtailed. What was being curtailed? Municipalities told about cutting down on maintenance, on repair, on rehabilitating of infrastructure. Remember, if you will recall, in 2003, and it was soon after I had left working in Parliament, the Portfolio Committee on Energy and Resources was told at that time about the investment which was required in Eskom. Government at that time, ANC government, decided, under Mbeki, decided that wasn't going to happen. And so that lag, because it's driving towards surplus and because austerity is now kicking in, compounded to the neoliberal state is this austere approach to the maintenance of infrastructure, the expansion and investment in public infrastructure, massive public works programs, massive rollouts of basic services, interventions in prescriptive policy in the economy, because at that time trust in the state was high, it was possible to do so. That was squandered. And in that squandering also came along this approach to the state in fairly austere terms, and all of this is underpinned by the erosion of ethics in our society, and for that matter, the question of morality. Because there's no other way in which we can explain. Surely we can partly explain high levels of crime, the indiscriminate way in which people behave. Now, some of that is attributable to the social conditions. It's not surprising someone who lives in the informality that they do would behave in that way, which brings me to the next point, the fifth, which characterized that period, ever increasing amounts of informality, both in housing, in transport, and in the economy, because more and more people are now falling outside of the net. And so as this starts to happen, the middle class, or a small middle class which developed at the time, started opting out of procuring all kinds of goods and services on the public market from the state. So they started using these things of the private market. And the question of that and its impact on development is actually quite fundamental, because it's the well-organized, well-resourced middle class who have the bargaining power to bargain with the state, to bargain with public servants, to bargain with everyone else, to hold them to account, who know how processes work, who can in fact do that to ensure that there's a scaling up of quality and so on. But because they're not doing it, it goes the way it does, because, you know, who takes a poorer person seriously? So while all these guys are doing this on the private market, the public sector is being left to its own devices. And we see the kind of thing that's been happening there. Now you go through that period, and of course we know there's a rupture in that come 2005, 2006. So we go into this new period, and there's a political rupture in the ANC. There's a promise that, you know, the focus and the fetishization of the individual, of the institutional, will be shifting away to focus more on people, firstly. Secondly, the austerity is something that's going to be rolled back. There's going to be more inclusive, more consultative president who's going to listen. The informality will be rolled back, and a greater number of things will be brought into the formal. Some of the promises made to the private sector was that they would be able to capitalize on some of these new things, because, you know, the state will still be partnering with the private sector, because none of the outsourcing, none of the subcontracting is suddenly going to disappear, even though some people were saying that was going to happen. So come a new administration, short 2 years after, there's already a deep sense of rupture, not just politically, but because the politics are so intertwined with the civil service. The political infection starts to infect the public service. And so public institutions start to be used in internal factional political battles, in internal factional economic battles, because from that time on, even though people pretended that the fracturing and the factionalism was political and ideological, it was far from it. And we know that the history of all politics is in fact the history of factions. Factions help to refine policy, they help to sharpen debate, they help to hold oversight over other parts of the party, they hold you to account, they refine policy. It is genuinely, robustly democratic if factions are based on ideas or ideology. In this case, factions pretended to be based on ideology, and for some people there may have been a naive belief that they are in fact so. They in reality were not. What they were was a mask or a shadow, which was a face for something else which lurked behind it. And what lurked behind it was in fact a completely eroded approach, not just to institutions, but an eroded approach to institutions and the economy. And so what starts to happen is that the Guptas become more prominent, right? And I don't want to fall into this trap and say that Auwal was simply a bad guy, that he was manipulated by the Guptas. He was. And the consequence of what happened then was that here was a person who may have been somewhat naive, but was also Machiavellian, more Machiavellian than Mr. Mbeki was reputed to be, in manipulating state institutions. And so now what starts to happen is that the manipulation we spoke about starting to happen around 2005 starts to become much more serious, because the manipulation is a manipulation of the public service and the civil service, its rules and procedures, and pitted against the rules and procedures of the party. So every time this person committed an indiscretion or an infraction, or there was a breaking of the regulatory instruments of the state, which is now continuing from the previous period, it was justified on the basis of saying, I can defend it because the party's rules and procedures allow for this. When the party was trying to deal with you and get a degree of accountability, institutions of the state were being used for this. So here you are, is you tame all of the institutional public edifice of institutions to serve private political ends. And so what's happening here is you've got dual processes happening. First is you have a process of the undermining of sovereignty purely for avaricious and an accumulative trajectory. And the second, while not as pernicious as the first, is basically abusing all of the processes of the outsourced or the subcontracted state and engages in things like price inflation and so on. So in the first instance, what we're talking about when we're talking about the undermining of sovereignty, the undermining of sovereignty includes the latter bit, which is to inflate prices, to collude, to break the regulatory framework, to engage in collusive behavior with each other for protection through abusing public institutions. All of that is a feature of the undermining of sovereignty, plus the inflation of prices. And here you've got multiple examples. You can think about the SABC, cross-subsidizing the New Age and the Gupta's television station at the time, ANN7. But more perniciously is you have entering into contracts which ought to be pure public service, whether it's in public transport, whether it's in the rollout of basic services, whether it's about security and policing, in all of the, whether it's in education, in all of the areas where you improve the lot of people's lives and you start to impact on the economy, there is this kind of unethical, immoral infraction going on all across the board, in all public institutions. And it finds its apogee both in the case of Nkandla, and the Constitutional Court judgment is instructive, as is the case of what happened with Bosasa, where the nature of that kind of abuse was not as pernicious as the first, but was sufficiently pernicious because it's open issues of bribery, the rigging of tender processes, the manipulation of tender boards, and so on. And so erosion in trust starts happening very seriously, and there are massive declines in the trust and confidence of the state to do what it ought to do. And then comes another rupture, which continues from the period before. And this rupture is premised on the question of rehabilitation, the question of setting right what may have gone wrong, and to go back onto a development trajectory which will be more considered and which will be more deliberate, and in which there would be interventions, not just in the regulatory sense, but an actual intervention through stimuli, through stimulus packages, and so on. And so, but when you really look at it, the stimulus packages aren't in fact a stimulus package. They're a stabilization package. But you would have to call it, in order to call it a stabilization package, you would need to be honest enough to say the destabilization was actually done by us. So no one's going to want to call it a stabilization package, therefore packaged as a stimulus package. But it's a curious stimulus package, which doesn't create any tax breaks, which doesn't put more money into the pockets of people like you and I, where we have a little more to spend, where there's no real intervention, or to the extent that there wants to be intervention in the economy through prescriptive policy, the level of trust is so low that no one will trust you to do so. There is very little by way of major investment in public infrastructure. And so the call, the appeal would be, but we were hit by COVID-19. Well, COVID-19 is happening almost 2 years into the term of office. Doesn't explain why things didn't happen in the first term of office. And so you almost get a sense of an impending breakdown in this development trajectory. So to the extent that there is a development trajectory, that's the way in which it can be characterized. Now, there's one thing that one needs to say about the fact that, look, every state resources itself. The tax administrator was fairly efficient, was fairly effective, was premised on a delicate balance between coercion and consent to be taxed. And so people willingly paid their tax because there was a perception, more or less, even though things were not great, there was a more or less idea that there was enough trust that the tax revenues were being used in fairly prudent ways. They may have had problems with the way PE operated. They have had problems with the space available for debate. They have had problems with the HIV and AIDS debacle. All of those are necessarily true, but there was a genuine trust that there was an attempt to do the best possible. Once that trust was eroded, the ability of the revenue raiser, of the revenue service starts to decline, and you can no longer even rely on the delicate balance between coercion and consent, because even the coercive measures, the measures where you have to use repression or the threat of sanction, punishment, is not sufficiently strong because you just simply don't trust this. Now, one example of this, early example of how this erosion started to happen, is the way in which people viewed their obligations to, say, for example, UIF as opposed to paying tax. People thought paying UIF would be good. You're helping someone, your domestic worker, you pay his or her UIF, gardener, and at some point there's some social protection, it helps them. But because the Department of Labor is perceived to be so poor at enforcement and sanction, people simply left it off. They justified not doing so, not paying it, on the basis of saying, I'd rather give them the extra myself. The person doesn't want it. They say they rather have the extra money in their pocket and so on. Whereas your obligations to tax at that time was that if I don't pay it, I will be caught. Unlike the Department of Labor, this entity is actually fairly strong. So once you have confidence in a state institution which functions well, efficiently, effectively, your desire for compliance is much higher, and it can help the tax take, it can help resourcing the state, it can help extending the services of the state, provided the state itself is viewed as credible, as trustworthy, and as doing what it is supposed to do. And that, I'm afraid, moment has passed. And so to recover it, a much stronger sense of ethics, a much stronger sense of morality, and a much stronger sense of the relationship between productivity and investment in the public service is going to have to be visible in order for this to happen. And so, to the extent that we talk about the South African development trajectory, we can characterize it as both constructive but also contradictory in the first hand. Second, progressive, but also regressive, because it is progressive in intent, but has been regressive in operation, in part because of the nature of the policy mix, and in part because of the erosion of ethics and the incentivization of bad behavior. And third, because of the nature of bad politics. And bad politics, because government is a byproduct, or government doesn't exist before a process of politics. But because politics are bad, it's likely that you end up having bad government. And that's where I think we are with regard to our development trajectory. One last word before I conclude. So where did all of this come from? Well, all of this came from, because I think the characterization pre-1994 was, and carry over from the pre-94 era into the new era, was slightly mistaken. Why do I say so? Because South Africa was characterized as a society of colonialism of a special type, where the colonizer and the colonized exist in the same geographic space, they share the same space, they share the same resources, they share the same infrastructure, and they are one society for all intents and purposes. It was also premised on the idea that there are no inherent antagonisms amongst Black South Africans, because all are equally oppressed. Come 1994, and in the period from my first characterization up to the second, that formulation by necessity has to change, because there now are inherent antagonisms among Black South Africans, whether it is because of class mobility, whether it is because of access to state power, whether it be because of compacts with white capital, whatever the case might be, inherent antagonisms have of necessity now started to define Black society. And so the idea of colonialism of special type no longer applies. Yet, it remains the conceptual underpinning by which a lot of thought is given to the configuration of policy, number one. Second, to the extent that apartheid could be characterized, in addition to colonialism of a special type, also as racial capitalism, is that if that racial capitalism continues to persist as the characterization, but also the one who you are now going to develop policy to unravel, then the way in which it is doing so is reflexively doing so by replacing one form of racial capitalism with another form of racial capitalism. And this second form of racial capitalism that we see in evidence now is in fact less racial capitalism and more simple exploitation of a set of public resources through crooked and contract networks and complex networks of patronage and prebendalism, as it's called in the formal literature. And so I think that characterization now needs to change. We need to rethink a formulation of who and what South African society is in order to develop the appropriate instruments in order to move us to a different or a better development trajectory. But if one thinks about what's going on in our political class today, the prospects of that might seem quite dim. And on that pessimistic note, comrades, I'll leave it open. I was told that I can speak for 45 minutes. Unfortunately, I took all 45.
No. It's been good, Ebrahim, and comrades. Thanks for your views. You've given us lots of things to think about, and and a lot of food for thought in your input. And you made me think a bit, more especially as you close off on your contribution about the structure of where we are and where we come from. I have heard of this concept of racial capitalism quite a lot, and it was predominant more so in the early 80s, where I think those of us were on the left of the political spectrum, began to discuss about whether there is such an economic setup where you find racial capitalism. Because how do you racialize capitalism? And if we hate capitalism, we have to hate capitalism, in all its intents and purposes, whether we are free of racism or not. And because remember, we are in a racist society largely informed by the capitalist setup that we find ourselves in. And I think, majority of us have always looked at, the structure of our country as, suffering from both racism and capitalism, because, one is embedded in the other. But once you begin to racialize capitalism, then, I begin to have a problem as to how do you then, fight, against capitalism or fight against white racism if you begin to racialize capitalism. That is just an aside comment to your input. You've spoken a lot about morality and ethics, and a lot of people are asking questions as to whether we should legalize ethics and morality. And I don't know if you begin to say, well, we'll legalize ethics, we'll legalize morality, and whether it would solve the kind of problems that we have in the country, because we haven't gone far, in developing our country, largely because of racism, and largely because of corruption that is embedded in our country, and we don't seem to be seeing any actions, that are taken to eradicate these ills, in our country. What I also wanted you to comment on is whether you see any change in the real structure of our economic development path. Because you spoke of what you call or characterize as colonialism of a special type, wherein we were all settled in, and assuming that the Black community is kind of homogeneous and would be taken as a group of people who would not be impacted much once the Black people take over the governance of the land. And what we have seen over time is that in this neoliberal setup, we continue to suffer the effects of colonialism, and we continue to effectively manage a colonial setup on behalf of those who had settled before and oppressed Black people in the manner in which they have. So it would be interesting to hear what your thoughts are around those issues. And I think at some point we would need to call a spade for what it is, and say, well, we haven't really seen any development path that is underpinned by any ideological framework in this country. And where are we going as a country? Is there a trajectory that defines the path that we're in? If you look at all of the policies that have been developed over the last 26 years or so, or even before then, because we moved from an economy that was really driven by resources. It's a resource-based economy, and whose products were exported out of the country for the benefit of others and not so much for the benefit of our own people. And yet, the biggest problem that we have been confronted with has been, centered around poverty, unemployment, and all of those ills, without focus on, regenerative economy, where our own government focuses on, reproduction of the economy for the benefit of our country, doing the reprocessing of the minerals that are produced in the country for the benefit of the country, so that you can focus more on the what I call direct domestic interventions, so to speak, as opposed to the foreign direct investments that we have seen in the past. So maybe I should stop there and hear what you think about my comments.
Thanks, thanks, Comrade Simpiwe. The first one, I think, is a very difficult one, and I see comrades even in the chat are asking, should we eventually reach a point where you legislate ethics and morality? Guess what? The reality is that much of this is already legislated and in some form of regulatory document or in some form of regulatory instrument, right? And the point I was hinting to is that we've got many of these things codified. There simply is no respect for it. So issues of compliance are we just don't care, because if you can get away with it, you do get away with it. So what we're talking about here, when we talk about factions, is we're talking about the classic rational actor. The rational actor is the person who maximizes their reward and minimizes any risk, which means they maximize whatever they can profit off, and they minimize whatever the costs are to them. And if it means that if you break the rules and with impunity, because we haven't used that word, and it's a word which nicely characterizes who we are. If you behave with such impunity, and no one's going to happen with you, the predictability and consistency of the application of rules. Remember when I made the example of SARS? If that equation of predictability and consistency and the fairness in the application of those rules, you are not confident that that's going to happen. People are likely to be caught or sanctioned, or you'll be protected politically. Then you go ahead and do it. See? Yeah. So that's the first problem. The second problem is any governance system, any regulatory system, no matter how watertight it's going to be, can never close every loophole. It is impossible. That is why a certain minimum modicum of ethics is absolutely vital, right? You try and configure regulation on the basis of closing every possible loophole. But you must start off from the premise that the reason I'm having law, the reason I'm having regulation is in order to curb or in order to prevent bad things happening. I think our approach has been wrong-headed because we have started on the basis, whether it's constitution making, law making, or regulation, we start from the premise that we are going to codify things in order to promote good, not prevent bad.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
I hear you.
We need to change tack because we've discovered we are not the angels we thought we were. So we now have to construct regulation on the basis of preventing bad, not promoting good. And maybe then we can close up as many loopholes as possible. I don't think it's ever completely possible, but that's my answer to that. Then, okay. Comrade, you're talking about racial capitalism, right? And you are right. It's hard to imagine that you must characterize the society either as racist or either as capitalist. Because when you racialize capitalism, I mean, how is it possible? Because the very logic of capitalism is that you maximize and you extract as much as you possibly can. Now remember the whole colonial enterprise and the whole apartheid enterprise. Well, apartheid's different. Let's leave apartheid out for now because the way in which we characterize apartheid will determine a whole range of things. But the whole colonial enterprise is about maintaining the capital system or the capitalist system and overlaying it onto it, that the accrual of benefits flows only to a particular kind of in-racial grouping. That's largely what it's about, right? So come apartheid does that to say, let's forget the antagonisms among white South Africans. Because remember, there were antagonisms among white South Africans. And so much as we assumed that, okay, in the pre-94 period, to the extent that we talk about grand social antagonisms, there weren't grand social antagonisms amongst blacks, right? People now, revisionists, like to talk about the hierarchy of oppression, and we can have that debate separately. But by and large, there were very few antagonisms amongst black society generally. White society did in fact have many antagonisms in the lead up to grand apartheid in 1948. Which is why they had their Boer republics, and then they had colonies, and then they came together in union, and then they declared a republic. But the latent residual cultural antagonisms among them remained. And that's why you had the formation of white English-speaking mining capital with a little bit of Afrikaner intervention. But by and large, you had Afrikaner capital existing very separately from white liberal in inverted commas, because they're not really liberal. So that capital formation was slightly different, right? Come 1994, well, even through the 80s, I think they realized that, listen, we can't, the whites, as a society, as a community, we can't do this if we don't band together. Now, I can't imagine how else you characterize this but as racial capitalism, because it's retaining all of the logic of capitalism. Or accumulation. And remember, comrades must be sure, when we talk about capitalism, we are not saying the ordinary person like you or I who makes a profit if we are in business. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about grand accumulation, right?
Yeah.
Or the exploitation of surplus value in general. That means you must oppress labor and do all kinds of other things in order to extract that surplus. We're talking grand scale here. But so on that scale, they knew there's nothing they can do to protect each other unless they come together. Now, come 94, we take over, we call it non-racial. And to the extent that we say BEE, affirmative action, all good, affirmative procurement, also good, except that it is taking positive discrimination, legitimately so, but applies it completely incorrectly. And in the incorrect application of it, creates a counter-racial capitalism, if you get what I'm saying. So you and I can commonly agree that, look, affirmative action, absolutely vital. I'm not sure that without those policies, people like me would be where we've had access to opportunities to the same extent. It may not have been possible. We've got to admit that, right? So to a degree, it's absolutely vital, absolutely necessary. But when it starts being abused because the logic of capital is inserted, I mean, what can explain that amongst us, there are now people who buy multi-billion rand houses, splash thousands on a weekend at celebrity events, which I'm not being moralistic. I'm simply saying, where does that come from? So it's hence I say the characterization is putting one form of racial capitalism against another. Because those people who say, ours is not racial capitalism, we are just doing what it is that any capitalist does. The problem is that you are behaving in prebendal ways. You are not ensuring that someone like me or you ends up being an advisor in those companies or working there or providing strategic services to them. You and I are still in waged employment. We are still in salaried employment. Those people have not ensured the accrual of those benefits get redistributed across society. No one here is arguing that they must give everything away. People like to think we are arguing this in crude terms. That's not it. The thing is, from all that surplus value you've generated, what has gone back into research and development? What has gone back into market expansion? What has gone into job creation? In fact, what the black capitalist has done is mimic exactly the white capitalist in even narrower terms. The white capitalist has to some extent ensured a redistribution, even if of a small amount of benefits within their in-group. Ours have not done so for us. Of course, the scale is vastly different. There are many more of us, so it's much harder to do. But the reality is, even if you want to take a small group, I mean, how many of them have created those opportunities for us? So how else are we supposed to characterize it, comrade, if not a counter form?
I suppose, comrade Ebrahim, I suppose it's a discussion for another day because, you know, it's really interesting. I don't know, have we really developed a country where we have managed to produce what you call black capitalists? Because, I mean, you know, capitalism, it's about ownership. And racism also speaks to ownership and how, you know, we relate to each other with regards to who owns the economy. And, you know, the relationship that exists at the present moment is such that, you know, we as Black people are not really loved by, you know, the white race. And, you know, that tribe hates us not because of the fact that we are Black, but because of, you know, our proximity to the, you know, through the economy and who really owns that economy. And they still, you know, by and large own it, and they have continued to own it, and which is why you see, you know, a lot of our people continuing to manage it on their behalf. But I suppose that's a discussion for another day. What I'm more interested in at the present moment is whether, you know, looking at what we have seen, there is a development model that can be offered to those who are governing our country in such a way that it can eradicate poverty and unemployment, because I think that's been a pervasive problem that has confronted our country for this long. And I believe, I mean, you and I agree that there hasn't been any development path that has been developed over, you know, the last, you know, quarter of the century. So we need to come up with something that, you know, we can offer, you know, the society and say, well, here is a development path. What would you consider that to be as some kind of an answer to, you know, this pervasive problem of, you know, poverty and inequality as we move towards, you know, closure of this discussion?
So for me, there are two approaches to this. The first is what I would call the micro approaches, and the second is the macro approaches. The micro approaches is we should do everything we said or that is said should be done in all of the policy documents that exist across the spectrum, whether they be about municipalities, whether they be about local transport, whether they be about social and community housing projects. All of those things are absolutely vital at the micro level, because there's no path to social mobility, which is a magic wand, which if you wave it is suddenly going to develop this, right? So all of those things are correct. No one is saying that's incorrect. The problem is that it's not being implemented, it's not being applied. To the extent that it is being abused. So contractors who engage in RDP projects build shoddy houses. The location of where it happens is incredibly bad. It's not proximate to anything really. The development of transport nodes that service them are incredibly poor. The rollout of basic services. So if you do those micro interventions, which you say you're going to do and have been saying you do, it's at least one leg up into social mobility. The second, which is more contentious, which is the macro issues. The macro issues for me are also quite clear. Two things to stand out completely, and the one is brought home very clearly after this COVID-19 scenario, is that we have to absolutely have a policy of import substitution. We have to develop nascent industries. We have to subsidize it. Forget what the global economy says. And if we had better negotiators at the WTO and elsewhere, we would be having greater protectionism for us. And why shouldn't we have greater protectionism? And that protectionism, if we are honest and if we are ethical and if we are moral in the way in which the regulatory framework will work, should in every instance benefit and privilege a Black majority, in the sense that there must be set-asides for Black industrialists. There has to be incentives, special incentives for Black manufacturers and so on, right? So that kind of protectionism, which will apply to all South Africans, irrespective, even the white counterparts, because they will be contributing to our revenues and to our... And here's the thing about white South Africans, I think we must start to use them. And this is my problem with my own background in Black consciousness, is that I don't think that we've used them enough to the extent to say we're going to put you to work, to come and work in these areas. We'll be your bosses, but you're going to, so we're not going to cut you from opportunity. You'll get a good salary, but you put yourself to work. Anyway, even though they will benefit from this, there must be certain set-asides of these subsidies for us, right? So import substitution for me is absolutely vital, which will help with beneficiation, which will help. Now look, under the Mbeki administration, which I omitted to mention, diversification was a big feature in the economy. Though there was a reliance on commodities and the commodities boom at the time, we've got to be fair to say that under Mbeki, there was significant diversification. Tourism and agriculture started taking a bigger share of the economy, but the biggest increase was in financial services, commercial services, and business services. But things like business process outsourcing, insurance, banking, we had good infrastructure and regulation around that. And so diversification started to happen. The problem is we allowed those who already had a foothold to run away rampant with everything, rather than, and this is what I mean when I talk about prescriptive policy, we ought to have had prescriptive policy which directs how that could have happened, which conglomerates can be formed and by who. It's very regulatory intense, right? And it could have benefited Black South Africans if properly defined. But if you leave it to the arbitrage of the market, then the Black South Africans who are exploitative get together with their white counterparts and continue to do this. To me, it's curious that even though we've had the diversification, those who ran away with it, we didn't see a new major Black insurer or a major Black medical aid company. We've got the beginnings of a Black clinic holdings and so on, but they're minuscule in relation to the others. So here the policy frameworks created, diversification is a feature. Tourism, another example, right? Tourism, big increase. Accommodation, special services, even the use of these services by government is extensive. Yes.
No, it's fine. Can we just listen to this comrade quickly?
Sure.
Comrade Try.
Hi, Comrade Tasha. Are you good? Hi, Ebrahim. I'm good. Hi, Ebrahim. Thank you very much. This is a great presentation. I just wanted to make a comment and probably end it with a question. My comment is that there's been a legend that is going around South Africa, and I feel now it's a serious propaganda that there's a lack of skills, this lack of skills, that lack of skills, the other. And my view is that around from the 80s or a little bit prior, but from the 80s to continue to the 1994s, there's been a number of skills that have been developed in the country, which are available. From the, you can start from engineering and go and end on the social things and the economics. Now, my view is, one, the COVID-19 has caught us napping in that if the rollout of laptops and everything in the schools was done properly, at least we would have kids sitting at home doing something. A lot of things that happened since 1994 to now that are related to corruption have just completely messed our economy. And I'm agreeing with Ebrahim when he's saying COVID-19 just came at a time when we were kind of sleeping, and all of a sudden we were caught napping and we were in trouble. Because if all those things were rolled out, then at least we would be in a better position today. Economy doesn't fall within a week and it falls into pieces and it's on the ground. It happens over a period of time. Now, my view is we need to move now from this position of like, of saying, if I would put it in inverted commas, we're complaining this is happening and that is happening. We need to move probably to a stage where we're saying, what do we do next? You look at the split between there is a racial, not racial, like there's a lot of reliance on grants. And you find that the education, as much as there's a lot of money being spent in that environment, the quality thereof is it's not coming through. So it will delay the time that we're gonna be out of this trouble, or out of this economic trouble. Then I must ask Comrade Ebrahim. Now, Comrade Ebrahim, where do you see us going from here now? And I think this is one of those things of saying we create awareness and we need to start moving and doing something, because it looks like in a South African context, until you stand up and do something from each and every corner, even if it's in our little corners, where do we go from here?
Look, I mean, Ibrahim will respond to that. Thanks, Shai. But, you know, the interesting thing about COVID, what it has managed to demonstrate is the extent of inequality in our country. You know, exactly. Whilst, you know, the kids have been staying at home and doing nothing, you know, our kids, as you know, those of us who are referred to as, you know,
middle class
and so
upwards,
forth.
Yes.
And the kids of the white communities have continued to be educated and have continued to learn, whilst the majority of kids, you know, did not study for the rest of the year. Ibrahim, maybe as you can respond to that and also give us your closing comments and remarks.
Just to add a little bit, Comrade, but I'm very sorry that I've got to jump in a little bit here. This, you know, you've put in a very good example that, and our economy is not going to be able to be sustained by the kids from the backgrounds of middle class upwards, you know, if I may say that.
No. Okay, cool. Thanks, Shai.
No, Comrade Shai is absolutely right. And I think echoing perhaps more articulately than precisely what I have. I mean, there's no excuse for why we don't have the best public schools around. I have no idea why. We should, given the amount of resources dedicated. If you think about, you know, perhaps I was wrong too, in the sense that I simply care, but I was being precise about my characterization of neoliberalism. My characterization of neoliberalism was about the outsourced state, about the subcontracted state, and about the incentives built in there for capitalists to inflate prices, to collude, to be anti-competitive, to develop monopolies, all of that, right? But that's not what, I mean, that's what I mean by neoliberal. I don't mean in terms of, insofar as I said we had austerity, we still had close to 60 to 63, 64% of national treasury of the budget goes into health, education, and welfare in the broad social sector. You add things like public transport subsidies and so on, the figure goes even higher. So we spend a lot of public money on services which should be ensuring the ability for us to live a reasonably decent life. But why are the outcomes so poor? It's not always about skills. It's about attitude. It's about attitude. Now, we are not in the 70s, we're not in the 80s where, you know, comrades have to run self-help schemes. That may be necessary. And if you're asking where are we going as a society, maybe that's where we need to go now, because clearly we have been in command of the state, but that state has not been at our service. So what do we do?
I think the real question is whether, you know, those who are governing the states on our behalf are capable of doing so. You know,
maybe they need black consciousness, but not the crude black consciousness, because they've been misusing, they've been abusing the idea of blackness. They've been using and abusing the idea of identity in terms of their own service. I mean, to be frank, they've had a chance, and I don't think that they have proved that they have the best interest of all South Africans at heart, particularly black South Africans, because it's black South Africans who are worst affected when you buy the wrong gauge railage, you know, when you buy infrastructure which doesn't fit your gauge. It's not other South Africans who suffer with that, it's us. It's if you leave the taxi industry the way it is, if you leave public transport the way it is, you leave public education and public health the way it is, you can talk as much as you want about what a great champion you are of black South Africans. If those things don't work, it's affecting black South Africans most. So we must chuck that out the window. They're not capable. Let's just be frank. Unless they show a complete and demonstrated commitment to this, we're not interested in what happens inside the ANC. That's the ANC's business. They must do whatever it is they want. They want to cannibalize each other. Yeah, go ahead, do so. But don't pretend as if you're doing this in the name of all of us as a collective, when in fact you're doing it for yourself. My concluding remarks, and I'm going to say that much of what Comrade Shai is saying, I agree with. He said so much more eloquently. You asked me, and I'm going to conclude on this. What do I think the development path should be? I absolutely think the micro interventions are absolutely all correct. There's no other way to social mobility and to development other than that. At the macro level, I went through two. The one, policy of import substitution, set-asides and special subsidies for black South Africans in industry and in manufacturing, some degree of protectionism to the extent that we can in relation to the global market, enhancing diversification. We can't stick to just having, I believe we now have the greatest complement of rhodium in the world. So I believe, and it's like a major new thing in demand in China, Europe, India, everywhere, because it apparently helps to clean the air of emissions, and it helps you with your emissions. So apparently we have that, but we can't rely on the commodities. We have to further develop and enhance the commercial business and financial services. We have to ensure upscaling in agriculture, right? All of those things. So diversification, that's the third. And the fourth, which is unpopular, but I would argue for a reimposition of exchange controls, to reimpose a modest minimum beyond which money cannot be taken out of the country. Now that's part of the prescriptive policy. The tragedy, and I'm going to end on all of this, is that some of us have argued for these kind of interventions by a black state for close on to a decade. We are no longer left with any leverage to make this argument because the level of credibility and trust is just so low. If people tell you that you can't trust the state to do this, even I who would argue for it, why would I want to give the state more power where it is shown in every area where it has been given power, it has messed it up.
Thank you, Comrade Ebrahim Fakir, for your views and comments, and thank you for spending the afternoon with us. Tomorrow we will be sitting here with Comrade Khaunti Balenotoba, and we will be doing some reflections on transformation of higher education in the era of democracy. And so come and join me in the conversation with him between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And then next week, Sunday, we will be starting with BC Week. As you all know, it will be the 43rd anniversary of the brutal murder of Stephen Bantu Biko. And we will be starting off our busy week and with a cultural and busy activist, Comrade Mulife Peto, who will be joining me on the other side of the line and reflecting about, the contribution of Black consciousness in the last 43 years. And thank you, Comrade Ebrahim, and thank you to all who managed to join us. Let's meet again tomorrow afternoon, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to comrades for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.